Hey everyone, it's Paul with the Proteus Academy. We're going to do another round review. Today it's going to be California Round Robin Gunn versus Nueva CS, the Bens as they are well known, hoping that my dogs won't bark in the next hour and a half and that you can't see the massive pile of unfolded laundry behind me. With that said, we're going to get into the round, and this round is happening for two reasons. One, because it was requested on our last video. Specifically, someone said they thought the Bens are overrated, which is kind of mean and unnecessary, and I think like a topic for a whole nother video. And secondarily, because PF Videos keeps allowing us to have excellent content, and we really appreciate them having such a well-developed archive. With that, let's get right into it.
We affirm contention one is sharing is caring. Human 19 of CNN reports that Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners.
I'm just going to stop real quick for a second already. I think that the trend in PF of doing like these really dumb contention names that like sound cute is kind of ridiculous and frankly not necessary. I don't know what it does for you, and it's like, I guess it's just a meme thing. Maybe one of you can tell me why in the comments. Moving on.
American-made weapons to Al-Qaeda fighters, Hardline Salafi militias, and other radical groups. Indeed, the Hurricane 19 reports that the Saudis are now using U.S. weapons as currency to buy off different factions and terrorist militias in the Yemen conflict, right?
Okay, so first argument essentially is that U.S. weapons are funneled from Saudi Arabia into terrorist organizations, which allows conflict to happen elsewhere.
Terrorist groups destabilizes all the Middle East as the Lewis Federal Reserve 18 writes that terrorism in increased security costs and loss in productivity of the workforce, which is why they conclude that each additional transnational incident reduces the affected country's growth rate by 1.4%.
Okay, this is the argument. I watched this earlier, just for the record, when I was working out, because I wanted to get an idea of how I thought about the round in general. I found this argument to be a bit weird, right? Like, it says it reduces a country's growth rate by 1.4%, but I'm not clear on what growth rate they're actually talking about, right? Is this the GDP growth rate? Is it the growth, like, is it the GDP per capita? Like, there's a bunch of different metrics that this could be referring to, and I'm not sure in terms of productivity as they're framing it, or efficiency, or like worker stability, why the gun trade necessarily goes into that. I'm also not sure why like perhaps Saudi Arabia having to develop its own arms industry wouldn't increase GDP or something of that nature rather than having to import them.
Contention 2 is Yemen.
And they said that was contention 1, which was like 5 seconds with no impact. And so like Sasan talked about this in his last video, I think, and we've talked about this sort of ad nauseum in my long-form video essay on like the human condition and debate, the one-by-one model. But if your impact can't win you the debate, then it's a bad impact. And so I think right off the bat, like, you're in a bad position as the affirmative if your first argument is 1.4% growth. I have no idea what that means. It's not going to be quantified in any way, shape, or form later down the line in the debate. And so as a result, I just don't know what this gets for you. This is an important argument to remember. He just said that in 2015, that is when the Civil War conflict began, right? That's when the first sort of interference happened. That will become important later on. I'll point out when it is the case.
Conflict has quickly evolved to a humanitarian catastrophe. Harting 18 finds that Saudi Arabia's coalition has directly escalated the conflict, launching attacks that have displaced or killed tens of thousands of innocent civilians. The U.S. is at fault, as Weber 18 of the George Washington University explains, that most, if not all, of Saudi strikes with American-made ammunition and equipment. Okay,
obviously sort of the crux of their case that almost all of Saudi Arabia's attacks are predicated upon having U.S. armed support. That will be the crux of this debate. Can someone else fill in? Can Saudi Arabia figure it out? Discussions that won't happen, I'll point out later.
Arms sales does prevent meaningful negotiations in two key ways. The first is by convincing Saudi Arabia that they can win the war. Professor at NYU Bazi 18 writes that sending arms to Saudi Arabia signals to Saudi leaders that a clear victory in Yemen is possible, emboldening Saudi to put aside negotiations and focus on a military victory. As a result, Wesman 18 explains that the Saudi leadership has been emboldened to view the use of force as an increasingly central part of its foreign policy. Saudi is starting to perceive that the more arms they get, the more aggressive they can become. Ceasing arms.
Okay, so that's an important argument. They said that the more arms they get, the more aggressive they can become, and that getting the arms in the first place makes them think that they can have a decisive victory in the conflict, and as a result, there's no reason for them to go to diplomatic negotiations. I want to focus on specifically the argument that says that the more arms they get, the more aggressive they can be. Nothing in this case, at any point, to my knowledge, for the entirety of this debate, will say that the U.S. is actually increasing its arms sales to them, or that anyone else is increasing their arms sales to them in the status quo, which means aggression is capped in theory at a certain point already, right? How can they increase aggression if they are not receiving an increase in the weapons? And there's no argument that says that's the case. So this comes down to that topic Sasan was discussing, which is the question of, in the video he will make soon, controlling the direction of the link in terms of controlling the uniqueness debate, which is something that Ben Red Sweater will say later. I don't know either of their last names really. They seem like nice people though.
arms deals will put an end to this dynamic, as Rydell and the Brooklyn Institution finds that since Saudi Arabia directly depends on the U.S. for munition and spare parts, its forces would immediately be grounded if the U.S. stopped sending arms.
Okay, this is an argument that confuses me, saying that Saudi Arabia would be immediately grounded, right? Just take into context some arguments we talk about in like the gun control debate in the United States. One of our biggest problems is there's 300 million guns, which means that even if you ban guns tomorrow, they say it'll take something like 50 to 100 years to phase out 50% of those guns, right? Which means that if Saudi Arabia already has the munitions, the weapons, in theory, we're not keeping them like understocked, right? They need to be able to go on demand, which means that they have a surplus somewhere, or they're certainly rationing it in some way, which would seem to indicate that it's not like tomorrow or next week they're going to run out of these things, right? There are certain non-state actor groups that have been using U.S. weapons from like the 1970s for decades in order to be able to combat, which obviously it's a smaller scale conflict, but I just don't understand what the actual analysis here, and I would love to see this card, but obviously I don't get to.
Because Saudi Arabia would directly integrate with the U.S. hardening 18 reports that it would take decades for Saudi Arabia to transition away from U.S.-made equipment.
Okay, this is an argument that's just bullshit. There's zero chance that this is true. There is literally no country in the world that would set themselves up in such a position that it would take them decades to be able to rearm themselves if they didn't have U.S. support, right? You can look to Japan for this, right? This is why they talk about repealing, was it Article 9, I think, of their constitution or whatever that document is, in terms of having the U.S. be the one who would supply their weapons, right? They're ready to go, like, next year if they need it, at absolute worst. Countries have weapons set aside, and I think the idea that for decades Saudi Arabia is not going to have weapons is absolutely insane. But more importantly, and I think this is something that the Bens don't focus on in this debate, the affirmative just said that Saudi Arabia for 20 years after their AF has zero ability whatsoever, literally zero ability, to defend itself from another country, when the Middle East has some of the most terrorism it's had in history, arguments they will make saying terrorism is actually increasing, and is in an ongoing conflict with Iran, who is trying to nuclear arm itself. So, that's a bad argument.
Thus, Bosnia furthers that Saudi Arabia is more likely to attempt a peace process if it is clear the U.S. will not provide the military assistance required to continue fighting the war in the long term. Second is Houthi militarism. Saudi militarism is what justifies Houthis' aggressions. Dependers 18 in Transparency claims that the U.S.-Saudi military campaign against the Houthis gives the rebels legitimacy by allowing them to claim that they're defending Yemen from outside aggression. However, militarism does not force the Houthis to negotiate, as Lynch 18 foreign policy concludes that most Saudis' airstrikes target civilians, rather than the Houthi leadership, meaning they put no pressure on the Houthi leaders to actually negotiate.
I don't understand this. I don't think there's really ever been an instance in terms of conflict where civilians weren't targeted, right? Like, civilians are always going to end up being targeted and are always going to be collateral damage, and historically, civilians being attacked or becoming collateral has led to transitions in terms of regimes or various non-state actors or even state actors who were in power losing it. Like, this argument seems to indicate that because we're not, like, launching missiles directly at the heads of the Houthi rebels or whatever, that's the only way we can stop the conflict. Don't understand this at all.
Delays peace talks, as in Stratford 219 writes, so long as the Houthi men portray the Saudi-led coalition as the aggressors, they can keep up the recruitment numbers and preserve their standing with the many tribes of northern Yemen. Indeed, Leaf 19 of the Washington Institute explains that the majority of Houthis fighters are not ideologically aligned with the Houthis, but instead are simply anti-Saudi. Very important argument in the debate that does not come up again later, and I think should come up later. They just said on the affirmative that these people don't actually care too much about the conflict itself. They just hate the Saudis, right? And if that's the case, then the Saudis losing their weapons should, in theory, only embolden them. Like, if they're just anti-Saudi, I don't know why that would suddenly change in this world. It's not like Saudi Arabia suddenly starts caring about the Houthis. Like, they're one of the biggest human rights abusers of their own people in the world, and I'm sure that this wouldn't, in any significant way, mitigate that. Like, it just seems like a weird argument to make. Thus, Stratford furthers that the Houthis would lose the legitimacy they have gained in northern Yemen if its supporters believe that they're responsible for prolonging the conflict in the status quo. This is key. Propaganda exists is, like, I think the only relevant argument here. Like, I don't think the people are gonna, like, freak out on them because they feel like they're prolonging the conflict. And I just think that if what you said was true, that they just hate the Saudis, this doesn't change that. Like, not bombing someone doesn't make you suddenly like them.
you kind of hold on to the bombing. Ask Bosnia about that.
Ralph Latino, the Haaretz adds that the Houthis need legitimacy to maintain their powerful leadership. Historically, when the Saudis were not part of the picture, the Houthis repeatedly engaged in successful negotiations. Kuri 19 of the Hill reports that the Houthis have always maintained a readiness.
Who were those negotiations with? Like that, there's no context here. He just says that they've had successful negotiations, but if not with Saudi Arabia, then that isn't particularly relevant to the context of a negotiation with Saudi Arabia.
To engage in dialogue, and in both 2009 and 2010, they were able to end localized violence in Yemen through peace talks with the central government.
Okay, it said localized violence in Yemen, peace talks with the central government. No idea what that's supposed to mean in terms of the context of, was the central government bombing them the same way Saudi Arabia was? Were they like religiously opposed to them in the same way Saudi Arabia is in some instances? And so like it says 2009, 2010, like they had some negotiations over something with the central government, and that resulted.
Thus, Scripps 18 of the UN notes that a negotiated political settlement through inclusive intra-Yemeni dialogue is the only way to end the Yemeni conflict and address the ongoing humanitarian crisis.
Don't disagree that like dialogue's probably the only way to actually resolve for this. Just don't understand how your RAF solves for that.
Absent a shift to dialogue, the conflict in Yemen will only intensify, as the UN reported in 2018 that more than 17 million.
This is a good argument if the Warren actually said something that reflected it, right? This would be controlling the uniqueness and saying things are getting worse, which means that the status quo is unconscionable. The argument they're about to make does not say that. It just is a description of the status quo. It does not indicate that it is increasing in any way, shape, or form.
Million people, or over 60% of Yemen population, are at immediate risk of famine. And Bazi adds that absent measures right now, the war in Yemen will lead to the deaths of over 250,000 people from starvation and disease alone.
Yeah, people will die because the war will continue, but that is not a reason as to why the status quo is getting better or worse. It just means the status quo is staying largely the same where there was already a war.
In the long run, Pilar Atina Just Security finds that the civilian casualties from the Saudi campaign and U.S.-Saudi ties risk creating a generation of Yemeni civilians who see the U.S. as an enemy, increasing the recruiting ability of terrorist groups for decades and generations to come. Even if negotiations do not manifest, ending Saudi's bombing capability is still key, as Bandau 18 of the Cato Institute finds that Saudi airstrikes are responsible for at least 2/3 of infrastructure damage and 3/4 of casualties in Yemen.
Cool, that's the end of their case. Infrastructure damage. More importantly, that terrorism argument, they say that the United States will be viewed as like responsible for stuff, sort of the Hydra effect we've seen in places like Iraq or Afghanistan as a result of us, like, you know, invading them and bombing the shit out of them. And so as a result, I think this could have been a good direction for them to go harder on in the debate, but it's not particularly well quantified or explained. And I think that there are obviously arguments that say that like terrorism is relatively unimpactful in the last sort of 20 years, especially with regards to the United States.
Renegade, our sole contention is U.S.-Saudi relations. Currently, Christopher Blanchard of the Congressional Research Service explains last year that the relationship between the U.S. and Saudi Arabia has been defined by arms sales. W.J. Hennigan of Time confirms in October that for the last 75 years, the alliance has been built on a simple arrangement: U.S. demand for Saudi oil and Saudi demand for American firepower. U.S. ending American arms sales to Saudi Arabia will destroy two key facets of the U.S.-Saudi relationship, both which have catastrophic consequences. The first is oil exports. Saudi Arabia has the ability to control the price of oil, because Robert Rapier of Forbes found in 2018 that Saudi Arabia produced over 12 billion barrels of oil per day, roughly 13% of the world's oil production.
Okay. Important to remember that number again. 13% of the world's oil production is from Saudi Arabia. And I think that thus far, largely what has been said is true, right? Obviously, the Saudi Arabia-U.S. relation is predicated upon we give you weapons / we give you security assurances, and then you give us oil. I think there's some more nuance in there, which is also like the United States likes having Saudi Arabia as an ally, because otherwise they only have Israel, and then that can be problematic in some ways. But for now, let's just focus in on 13% of the world's oil is from Saudi Arabia. The thing that is not said here, and is very important, the number one exporter, or rather, yes, exporter of oil to the United States is not Saudi Arabia, as far as I'm aware. As far as I'm aware, it's like Canada by a significant margin. I'll look that up in a second here.
This control, they can spike oil prices in two ways. Subpoint A is directly withholding oil. Saudi Arabia has already threatened to increase oil prices if the U.S. ends its arms sales, because Javier Blas at Bloomberg finds in October that Saudi Arabia has said they would retaliate to any measures after the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi with stronger backlash. Historically, Riyadh has not hesitated to follow through with oil cuts.
Okay, that's an important argument, I think, that is being framed in a illegitimate way. Like, that was obviously in the context of, if we punish them for the Khashoggi thing, then they will backlash. That is not what the affirmative does in any way, shape, or form. Yes, obviously the affirmative happens in a world post Khashoggi, but like, it's not pertaining to Khashoggi. So I think there's some nuance there that's irrelevant.
In response to perceived aggression, because Greg Meyer of NPR reports in 2013, and when the U.S. supported Israel in 1973 in its war against Arab nations, Saudi Arabia cut oil exports and caused prices to soar. More recently, Dominic Dudley of Forbes found last September that when Germany imposed an arms ban on Saudi Arabia, it prevented Germany from receiving oil contracts, forcing them to resume the arms sales ultimately. The same would likely happen to the United States if it ended arms sales. Raper concludes that if Saudi Arabia withheld even a third of their oil from the market, prices would easily spike to.
Oh, that's actually a relevant argument. I'm still trying to look this thing up. I don't know why I'm so dumb when it comes to Googling things on my phone. But anyway, just now they said that Germany was forced to resume arms sales because he couldn't take the oil hit. Later on, the Bens are going to make a bunch of arguments about durable fiat. And durable fiat, for those of you who don't know, it means that we have to sort of assume that the AF is going to happen and the AF's enforcement will continue, right? Which means that there will indeed be no arms going to Saudi Arabia. If that durable fiat argument is true, then they don't get this argument, which indicates that, well, the U.S. will just have to go back to selling them arms because durable fiat.
For $200 a barrel. Subpoint B in the second way in which they can increase oil prices, not filling the gap. Because even if Saudi Arabia does not directly withhold oil, they can still
by 1.4%.
Oh, I messed up the video, but I'll get back to it. Don't worry about it. Anyway, I did find that number I wanted to find. The number is, Canada, per this graph, is like almost 4 times as much oil to the United States as Saudi Arabia. So that doesn't come up in this debate at all and seems important.
October. And for the last 75 years, the alliance has been built on a
skip.
increase oil prices in the U.S.
Great. Oil prices, back where we were, sorry.
At Bloomberg Finance in October, that Saudi Arabia has said they would retaliate to any measures after the killing of journalist Jamal Khashoggi with stronger backlash. Historically, Riyadh has not hesitated to follow through with oil cuts in response to perceived aggression, because Greg Meyer of NPR reports in 2013, and when the U.S. supported Israel in 1973 in its war against Arab nations, Saudi Arabia cut oil exports and caused prices to soar.
Oh, I actually kind of missed this earlier because I was Googling stuff. But this argument also confuses me because it seems to say that, like, U.S. support of Israel against, like, the Arab world results in Saudi Arabia, like, punishing us. But, like, since then we've only, like, tripled down on supporting Israel, and oil seems to be all right.
More recently, Dominic Dudley of Forbes found last September that when Germany imposed an arms ban on Saudi Arabia, it prevented Germany from receiving oil contracts, forcing them to resume the arms sales ultimately. The same would likely happen to the United States if it ended arms sales. Raper concludes that if Saudi Arabia withheld even a third of their oil from the market, prices would easily spike to over $200 a barrel. Subpoint B in the second way in which they can increase oil prices, not.
Okay, that's a really important statistic as well. It says if Saudi Arabia withheld even a third of its oil production from the market, it would cause massive spikes. Is the United States imports from Saudi Arabia a third of the market? Because if they are still selling oil to everyone else in the world, why would that cause oil spikes?
The gap. Because even if Saudi Arabia does not directly withhold oil, it can still hurt prices. As CNN business journalist Zara Akhalasi found in October, that because Iranian sanctions are leaving a hole in Middle Eastern oil exports, all Saudi Arabia would have to do is not increase their production and not fill in the gap to cause prices to increase.
Okay, this is important. This is them sort of setting the trap for later in the debate where they're going to go for, you've conceded that they are going to increase their production now, which means they don't even have to withhold it. They just have to keep with the status quo production, and that would still cause the problems. That does not get addressed very effectively later on in this debate. Spoilers.
Ultimately, oil price spikes are extremely harmful to the U.S. because they have minimal control over the market. Dutch geoscientist Gilles van den Buchel finds in 2017 that because the U.S. is not a swing producer of oil, it does not have the capability to fill in for oil export gas at short notice and possibly even at all. Matt Egan at CNN Business.
Why can't we import more oil from another country, like Canada, the one that we already get most of our oil from, or Venezuela, or really any other country that produces oil? We don't have to produce our own oil to fill in for those gaps.
Includes 2018, the U.S. already maxed out on its oil production capacity. And the impact of rising oil prices.
That is definitely not true. Like, there's things in place that Trump has already been trying to revoke in terms of, like, the Arctic shelf drilling and whatnot to increase our capacity to drill. I think that's a nonsense argument.
versus a billion lives, because Pat Westhoff at the University of Missouri finds in 2012 that increases in oil prices increase global food prices by causing production and shipping costs of food around the world to skyrocket. This is problematic.
All right, this is another bullshit argument in this debate. It literally just says that increases in oil prices causes the price of food to skyrocket because of production or something to that effect. How much of an increase in oil results in how much of an increase in the price of food, and like how many people are on the brink of starvation as a result of it?
As Minister Anderson, director of the International Food Policy Research Institute, finds that even temporary blips in food prices risk pushing 1.1 billion people into poverty across the globe.
Yeah, that statistic is clearly bullshit. It does not say how much of an increase in food prices this would result in, or how much of an increase in food prices would cause these issues.
The second key area of U.S.-Saudi cooperation is terrorism. Michael Knight of the Washington Institute finds in 2018 that another key aspect of the U.S.-Saudi relationship is counterterrorism, because Washington provides physical security for Saudi Arabia while they serve as a cooperative counterterrorism partner. As a result,
I'm going to stop this just for a second here. I think this is an absurd position to be running. In terms of like Saudi Arabia prevents more terrorism than like they've potentially caused or like trained or funded. I think that is absolutely insane and like is going to make no sense. Like, yes, they might have like the argument he's going to make in a second says like, yeah, they have a lot of insider information about terrorism rings, so they're able to thwart like this one terrorism attack in Detroit. Yeah, I wonder how they got that insider information. I wonder if it was by funding and training those terrorist groups.
Professor Nawaf Obaid at the Harvard Belfer Center finds in 2016 that in collaboration with the U.S., Saudi Arabia has created one of the largest and most efficient counterterrorism programs in the world. However, voting affirmative to end arms sales would seriously damage this partnership, as Rashawn Brown of the Naval Postgraduate School concluded in 2018. The arms sales are a key tenet of U.S.-Saudi military cooperation through the International Military Education and Training, or IMET program. Absent arms sales, such cooperation could not occur, which could carry serious consequences for two reasons. First, there would be more terrorist attacks, because U.S. collaboration with Saudi Arabia directly and independently deters terrorist attacks. The U.S. Department of State reports in 2018 that because of the U.S.-Saudi collaboration directly stemming from arms sales and military training, numerous terrorist attacks against Saudi Arabian foreign targets have been deterred. As a result,
they don't end military training. This won't be mentioned later on in the debate, but if military training is one of those aspects, they haven't explained as to why the arms specifically are more important. There's going to be an argument later in this debate that talks about how getting rid of arms sales isn't necessarily that important because there'll still be bases here. I think that this training argument could have been leveraged there as well to be more effective.
Guy Taylor of the Washington Times finds in 2018 that terrorist attacks are already down 20% globally.
Again, 20% globally, not contextualized to the Middle East, does not say that that is a result of the Saudi Arabia-U.S. coalition. Like, it says literally globally. So, like, is that because of the UN efforts? Because of the U.S.'s independent efforts? What's going on?
I said that terrorist attacks would be more successful. As Obaid explained earlier, the U.S.-Saudi counterterrorism program is one of the most effective in the world, and VOA News reports in 2018 that the Saudi intelligence operatives have an unrivaled network of connections in the Middle East that allows them to infiltrate terrorist strongholds and intercept plans. In fact, intelligence obtained with the Saudi government in Riyadh helped foil a suicide bomb attack in Detroit in 2009 and another in Chicago in 2010.
Okay, so if you're doing research, right, in theory, you want the most up-to-date evidence, right? And this card, I think it's from 2018 is what he said. I wasn't necessarily listening that closely. But the two terrorist attacks it isolates are in 2009 and 2010. And so you're telling me in 10 years almost they haven't been able to do anything in terms of terrorism that was significant, or that there has been no terrorism to thwart in the last 10 years. And something that just does not get discussed in this debate is, when was the last time there was a successful attack in the United States by terrorists? Like, just name one, really, right? That was in any way from an outside country, or that was well executed, or that caused any significant amount of deaths whatsoever.
Christopher Blanchard of the Congressional Research Service corroborates in 2018 that Saudi Arabia intelligence is invaluable to U.S. counterterrorism operations, having stopped 34 attempted terror attacks in 1 year alone.
What 1 year did they stop those 34 terrorist attacks in?
Preserve a key U.S. ally in the Middle East, we strongly negate.
So what happened in 1973 after the oil embargo was put in place?
I'm sure you want to tell me.
Ben does this all the time, and I think it's hilarious. Just not answer the question, just let them answer it. It's pretty funny, pretty smart.
So in 1973, after the oil embargo was put in place, the Saudis were seen as an unreliable exporter of oil on the market, which is why they burned all the bridges on their economic relations and economic ties with their oil partners, right?
How is that true if the U.S. and other countries still import a significant
Yeah, obviously it's been many years since then, but
Yeah, that was a really stupid question slash argument to make. If immediately the answer is like, but they do have really good economic ties, especially pertaining to oil with other nations. That is the linchpin of your case and ours in a lot of ways. I do not like just being like, yeah, but you know, a lot of years later it was fine. So you're saying the impacts of your AF will be fine in a number of years, and things probably will be all right, because the sort of like when we're talking about the 1973 incident, that is far more significant because it wasn't just the United States that was having the issues going on. Like that was a global issue, and as a result, like why would the impacts of this mirror that? And really, how bad was that incident overall? Like, yeah, people had to wait in line for gas. That sucked.
The reason that the U.S. and other countries still import large amounts of oil from these Saudis right now is that these Saudis have been made abundantly clear they would never repeat 1973 because they learned that from their mistake basically. So how is
Cool. So if they'll never repeat 1973, what does that mean for this debate? That they'll just never in under any like this is what I don't get. The AF is obviously unprecedented in a lot of ways because it's in theory a permanent end to weapons for Saudi Arabia, which would be a massive change in the state of global politics. I think to assume that them saying like we'll never do this again was not in the context of a world where the United States suddenly doesn't give them any weapons anymore right when they're in the middle of a conflict and when Iran is like very close to its most powerful in history.
How has this changed Saudi foreign policy in the status quo?
I mean, I think obviously they have a new leader. MBS has been shown to be more irrational with his decisions, and I'd say
Okay,
that
so what
they've
did the new
already
leader
said
come out with?
No warrant for that argument whatsoever about him being irrational. The other team just accepts it. That's ridiculous.
Saying really a couple months ago. He came out and said, along with the energy minister, that they would never actually, under their administration,
This card is not read in the debate as far as I'm aware. Maybe I'm wrong, but like this just gets asserted later on in the debate. Like, we have the only warrant that says that they would never do this.
spike oil prices in a retaliatory manner or any manner whatsoever.
I think our evidence probably postdates that because that card is from before Khashoggi was killed, and the new statement says they will do so after.
Okay, so if in 1973 their economy was crippled immensely, now you say that when they lose military backing, would they prioritize like getting back at somebody and getting revenge at the U.S., would they prioritize helping their own economy?
Probably getting back.
This is a weird conflation that happens in this debate, and I think that this would be a good chance for Ben number 2 / red sweatshirt Ben, as I think of. I just know the other Ben kind of, and so I call them Ben 1. Anyway, I think this would be a good time for them to point out like sort of the more nuanced debate here in terms of, because what's going to happen here is they're going to go into a question of, is security mutually exclusive from economy? And I think that is not the debate they should be focusing on, but rather the question of sort of necessity in terms of like, what does the world look like right now? Like, how is Saudi Arabia's economy? Is it resilient? How is their security? Is that resilient, or is that more threatened?
Back at somebody is their primary interest in conflict. Is
I mean,
in
I would
proxy war
contend
against
if
Iran.
these-
Also, it's not about like getting back at the United States. It's about getting back the weapons the United States provide them.
Probably more important
Okay,
how
sure.
they
So
show
if they
us.
want to win the proxy war and the U.S. weapons are out of the picture, what are they going to focus on? Their own personal economic stability or getting revenge on some big guy like the U.S. who
I
probably
think the
doesn't really
key
care at the end of the day?
key to winning a proxy war is not necessarily your economic capability, but rather how many arms
I
you
mean,
have.
I would say
how
if we
you
go
get
to an
other
economic
places,
recession and
stuff
your
like
whole
that.
economy collapses, that's not ever going to be in your own favor. So they would probably prioritize themselves over like getting back at the U.S. But do you want a question?
Sure. On Yemen,
Yeah.
why would the Saudis come to the table regardless? I mean, the coalition.
The U.S. had a recession a number of years ago, as some of you may remember. I'm pretty sure we still had like $1 trillion in military efforts globally being promoted. There is not a warrant here as to why economic recession prevents you from waging war.
Come to the table because Saudi Arabia is one actor. There are 9 other actors.
Okay, so
So
it's
why-
the
why do peace talks-
Saudi-led coalition? The
So
Saudis backed
why
out the
can't
other
someone
countries
fill the
all
gap?
way. So who would fill the gap?
The UAE.
Okay, well, the UAE, as of a couple of months ago, literally stopped their offensive campaign. More importantly,
This is important for the debate. I think what Gunn's doing here is shady. It's the same thing I talked about earlier with that previous argument, right? They're not going to read a card that really isolates us. They just say in cross-ex this is true, and then get to extend that later on in the debate as if it was a carded argument.
the UAE in a couple months ago started like withdrawing troops from parts of northern Yemen, and the overall
who is still
reason-
blading-
the overall reason is the UAE and their foreign policy has changed very, very much because they're facing
So why are there
pressure. They
There's
want-
not going to be a warrant for this in the debate, and this is still going to be in like summary / final focus. It's like internal pressure debate. Why isn't there one?
to get out of the war.
Why are there still a significant number of troops from the UAE blockading
Like,
the
there's
port
still
of
a
Beirut.
lot of troops in the port of Hodeidah, but like literally northern Yemeni areas, they withdrew all of their troops. But like the more important thing is like very, very simply, the UAE is facing so much internal pressure, and all these countries are, because in the status quo, there's
All of these countries, whose names I won't use, because apparently just every one of these countries is facing internal pressure. Because reasons like this is what I don't get, because it seems like part of this is like they're facing internal pressure because of humanitarian abuses in like 5 of the top 20 countries with the most humanitarian abuses.
large amounts of like humanitarian challenges and casualties. Insofar as that's true, the UAE, if the Saudis back down, would easily follow suit. I have like one quick question on your case. Your second warrant about oil says that they would not fill the gap. Isn't that literally just the same as withholding oil?
No, because even if they maintain their prices, because they plan oil increases to fill in the gap that Iran left.
Okay, so if they don't
So if
fill in the gap,
if they don't follow through with
if
those
they don't fill in the
increases,
gap, don't Iranian sanctions go away?
what do you mean? Why would they go away?
Because you say like Iranian sanctions are reliant on the oil being filled in. Otherwise,
no,
like, the market
Iran
sees it.
doesn't export the oil either way, because they're sanctioned.
We're only going to listen to the next 2 speeches. I don't have it in me.
At the top of their case, there's 3 reasons why relations would never change. First, what Tariff 15 explains is that when Sweden cut off arms sales to Saudi Arabia, it was a 1-week blip in relations, but they bounced back. That is the only empirical around. I would say you should evaluate that first. But second,
Does not say when those arms were cut off, does not say how many arms they were giving. I think that it's obvious that the United States is the #1 arms dealer in the world, especially to Saudi Arabia. Sweden is not even a blip on the radar, which is probably why it wasn't a blip in relations. And also, like, it's not contextualized to the relationship between them, right? Like, the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia is, as Ben said in the very beginning, completely contextualized to security for oil.
what Khalil 18 explains is the relationship between the U.S. and Saudis endured so much more in the last 85 years, like the oil crisis or the Khashoggi killing. Again, at best, get access to like a 1-week blip.
Why did it endure? Because we give them weapons and they give us oil, which is what the app changes.
It will always bounce back. But third, recognize the U.S. still has 5 military bases in Saudi Arabia. Again, it's not like arms sales are not the only component of the relationship. It will still exist in both worlds because both countries still have such a vested interest in trading, having a relationship with with the other country.
Okay, why does Saudi Arabia have a vested interest with the United States if they're not getting arms sales? You just say they have bases. The reason the United States has bases there is because we agreed to sell them weapons, so they allowed us to be able to have bases there in the first place. That is literally, like, you have this completely reverse causal. They didn't just say you can have bases and then sell us weapons. We said we will give you massive, massive funding for weapons and access to weapons that other countries don't necessarily get if you let us have bases there, because we also want to be able to tear up the Middle East.
With this in mind, let's go to their first warrant on oil exports. There's a lot of issues here. First, what Detroit 18 of Forbes explains, the energy minister of Saudi Arabia has literally come out and said they would not spike oil prices even if the U.S. passed sanctions, which means it's not probable whatsoever. But second,
Yeah, that was in 18, which means that Ben 2 was right about their evidence posting them in a world of Khashoggi. We don't even know if this minister is the same person at this point.
what Cap 18 explains, the Financial Post explains that after the 83 oil crisis, they learned their lesson because their economy was permanently hurt.
They said 73 earlier in terms of the incident with Israel. I'm not sure if they're talking about the embargo or not, because I'm dumb when it comes to history, but whatever.
And there's 2 reasons why it will also be hurt if they spike oil prices in the status quo. First comes from Chem 18, who explains that countries would shift to Russia or Iran, which would only hurt their economy. But second, what Chem 18 explains is other countries.
That's a reasonable argument that countries would shift to Russia or Iran, but I don't know how that works in a world of the United States when we have massive tariffs and other, like, embargoes even we've threatened those countries with. Like, in terms of Iran, they can't fill in, and in terms of Russia, I don't know why we would do that.
There's a shift to green technology again, which means their economy goes down.
Green technology is insane. The idea that, like, Saudi Arabia is no longer selling oil to the United States, I guess all of us should shift to Teslas. Like, I do not know the logic of this argument or the time frame, which I think is something that Ben 1 points out.
It's not done. They would never inflict self-harm. But third, what Jock 18 of Politico explains.
They said that they would never inflict self-harm, but isn't that exactly what they did per your own analysis of, like, the embargo previously and the previous incidents where they, like, had a massive recession and devastated their own economy?
is that Saudi Arabia is already losing influence in the status quo, so it would be political suicide to try and spike oil prices right now.
Losing influence with who in the status quo and why?
Means they would never do it whatsoever. But also, they're only empiric in this argument comes from Germany, but we call for the evidence, and it says even though Germany cut arms sales, there was no effect on oil prices whatsoever, so they're only empiric, probably flows to our side. Then on their
That argument would be important. Ben, I believe, already said it, and Ben will say it, but that's because Germany was forced to start selling them weapons again, which they can't do. Durable fiat. That's where the durable fiat stuff comes in.
second one, where they say that Saudi Arabia can fill the gap. There's a lot of issues here. First, what Miller 18 of CNN explains is that Saudi Arabia historically has ignored U.S. oil interests and will not fill in the gap. But second, with Swarovski 18...
What does that even mean? They've ignored U.S. oil interests in terms of what? Like, they trade us the oil still. They always have, near as I can tell. Your arguments say they would never, refuse to do it again.
Carmine Down explains is that U.S. producers have become more flexible in the status quo. We can already fill in this gap. We don't need Saudi Arabia. But third, what John 18 explains is the U.S. and other G7 countries can prevent this spike in oil prices because the U.S., for example, can just open up the Texas pipeline. So there's always ways that the U.S. and other Western countries...
Why does opening up the Texas pipeline solve for this? And is that something we can just do?
countries could always prevent this oil spike from happening. It is not probable whatsoever.
I just think that, again, why aren't they just saying there won't be an oil spike because it's only the U.S. and they only get X amount of oil from Saudi Arabia, right? This isn't Saudi Arabia stopping oil to the rest of the world. Why would the price drastically increase anywhere but the United States, the most affluent country in the world?
Their second warrant on counterterrorism. First, what Zenko 16 explains, in the last 10 years, terrorism has increased by 4,000%. They give one card saying global terrorism is down, but that is not isolated.
4,000%, meaning how many people, and where, and why?
Slaves to the Middle East, or is not about arms sales or the current counterterrorism that the U.S. and Saudi does. So I would say that if you really want to look at this out, look at the 10-year analysis, not just a one-year blip analysis. So if anything, if you want to look at that, empiric, we're probably going to outweigh there. But second, you can turn the arguments. What Pilar explains from our case is that in fact, U.S. arms sales have actually caused more recruitment because now these terrorist groups have painted the United States as destabilizing the Middle East. That is key because what Cali 17 explains is the recruiting for Al Qaeda has doubled in 2018, which is much.
I think this is what they should have. Oh, the dogs are barking. I knew that was going to happen. Anyway, I think what they should have done here... Too many dogs. I'm just going to have to edit this. Waiting. 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 Paul, this is where you should restart it again. Anyway, I think that the argument that he should have gone for here is this one, about the terrorism, the United States recruitment efforts, and how that would function, but that doesn't end up being a massively important part of this debate.
Better empiric than anything they give you that turns the arguments. But third, there's really no reason why these counterterrorism operations would go. It was Accord 18 of the Atlantic Council explains is that Saudi Arabia benefits the most from these operations. There's no reason why they would just give up on these and stop cooperating with.
How do they benefit and why?
U.S. if they're the ones that benefit them, and also the report also concludes that the U.S. also will have best interest in hitting them because the U.S. also has the best interest in stopping terrorism. But fourth, what Dudley 18 of Forbes explains is that these operations in the status quo are not effective whatsoever. Terrorism has increased by 4,000% in the last 10 years. Obviously, these operations are not working a lot in the status quo, but also they give you literally no isolated impact whatsoever. But fourth, you can turn the argument again. So Winter 18 of the Guardian explains that Saudi Arabia uses this counterterrorism legislation to justify crackdowns on their populations and human right violations, which only turns the argument. But at the bottom,
this is an argument they also could have gone for at the end of the debate, but doesn't end up becoming important. I think it's just going for the impact turn is probably a good idea.
We're going to outweigh their case for four distinct reasons. The first is time frame. Our case involves explains that right now, if we don't die, 255,000 people will die. That comes before anything else. But the second is magnitude. They literally get no quantified impact whatsoever. We know they would.
Other than the billion people who they said would die.
100% probability that 17 million people are starving in the status quo. The third is probability the core evidence is only empirical in the round that gives any solvency to either side. What it says in 09 and 010 before Saudi intervened, negotiations worked every single time to win localized violence. That comes first before this clarity of impact. If we don't die, 250,000 people will die. We have no idea how big their impacts are. There's nothing isolated from any of their links. So it can much easier. It's much easier to go for us. That's why it's a clear from the ballot.
I think that was a pretty good speech in a lot of places, and it's the end, especially in terms of the impact calculus. I think he's wrong, but whatever. All right, let's see what Ben does.
On our case, the first argument is that Sweden disproves one. The U.S. is obviously different from Sweden. Saudi Arabia cares way more about arms support than about our support than they do about Sweden support. Second, we read a
Not a warrant for this argument. This is something Ben does a lot because they are a Parley debater, and as a result, analytics are a thing in Parley. I think they're probably right, and that's true, but it's just an analytic, and I think that in a world where you should expect someone to be making arguments similar to this, there's no reason why you shouldn't have carded evidence.
Germany empiric, which probably means that these empirics wash out, and there's a question of our analytic estimates about what they'll do in response to the U.S. Then they say that we
Ben literally saying it's a question of our analytics. They say it's a washout. I think they did answer the Germany thing. I just think they did it wrong.
endured the oil crisis in Khashoggi, but those were both bad things that were done by Saudi Arabia that the U.S. was willing to endure. They haven't read any evidence about bad things that was done by the U.S. and Saudi Arabia was willing to endure. That also applies to their third argument about their...
I think that's a really important and really smart argument. Obviously not carded again, but yeah, that's what you're going to do a lot of the times in these speeches. I think that, yeah, that's true. Like, it's a question of which side has to endure what in terms of the relationship.
5 military bases, because those are things that Saudi Arabia are giving the U.S. and it allows the U.S. to forward deploy.
Exactly, right. The bases are a gift to the United States. It's not the other way around.
And have more hegemony there. It's not necessarily a good thing for Saudi Arabia, which means there's no warrant for why Saudi Arabia won't just revoke those as well. On our oil argument, their detriment evidence just says Saudi Arabia won't deliberately spike oil prices, but that doesn't mean that they won't. But our evidence just says that they just have to refuse to increase their output in response to increasing sanctions on Iran, which was sufficient to trigger our internal links to our impacts. Their chem evidence says they've learned their lesson from the 83 crisis, but the internal warrant is that they'll shift to Iran. But our whole argument is that because we're sanctioning Iran and we can't get oil from them, then they say there will be a shift to...
This whole little section here that just happened was smart. Good arguments, good comparison of arguments. I think I'm just gonna stop here for a second and just say, like, one thing that Ben does, like, better than probably anyone else in PF, as far as I'm aware, is this sort of comparison stuff, right? Ben doesn't read a lot of new cards in their speeches. Rather, they just have a good comparison of their original evidence from the shell against your evidence. And I think that can be impactful. I'm not sure whether it's the best thing in PF and evidentiary format of debate, but to me it's very effective.
Obviously takes a long time, plus our evidence says that Saudi Arabia will treat it as a try or die situation because they need U.S. support.
Obviously the evidence doesn't literally say try or die, and I'm not sure how much it implied that in the first place, but this becomes a point later in the debate, which I'm probably not going to end up showing you because it would take forever.
In order to ensure their defense, which means even if it's bad for their economy in the short or medium term, they would see it as something that they would have to do in order to try to force the U.S. to come back to the table.
That's a good framing, right? This question of short term versus long term. Like, is it good to take a hit temporarily in order to guarantee your security forever?
It says that our only empiric is Germany, and it says there was no effect on oil prices, but it says there was no long-term effect on oil prices specifically because Germany reinstated arms sales, which obviously...
This is weird because now Ben is recognizing that they did answer the Germany thing, but the very top of their speech is like, you didn't answer Germany. You only answered Sweden.
Durable fiat means they can't do their military...
More durable fiat stuff.
It says that Saudi Arabia has historically ignored U.S. oil interests, which is just a reason that they would also ignore our oil interests here. Their SWOT evidence doesn't have a warrant. Their SWOT evidence doesn't have a warrant. It's one line of a card which is taken out of context. There's also no reason that the U.S. domestic production will be able to fill in.
I think you should explain what that card says here, like what that one line says and why it is out of context. But obviously, you're limited time in this speech, so it's up to you.
Than it has in the past. I'm not going for a counterterrorism stuff.
This is a mistake in this debate, 100 million %, because all Ben says is I'm not going for a counterterrorism stuff, but there is a cold, conceited turn that was made in the last speech. I actually highlighted this argument, right, as to how counterterrorism just becomes a justification for them to crack down on their populace, which means that when you just say you're not going for it, that is a concession that they get that link turn because you have not taken out the link. This should have been game over in the debate. This is the biggest mistake in the debate overall, I think, from someone who I consider to be a fairly good debater.
Weighing arguments, they say time frame because 255,000 people will die, but there are a lot more people than that who are on the brink of poverty in the world who will be pushed into poverty because of rising oil prices, which will cause food prices to collapse, which means that which also needs to happen now. Saudi Arabia has to raise oil prices now in response to sanctions on Iran, which means we also access this time frame stuff. They say no quantified impacts, even if that's true. That doesn't mean that we can't win an offense off of all the people who are in poverty in the status quo. They say probability because they have the only empiric, but our Germany empiric means that obviously they don't have the only empiric. Derek. Their case on their first contention, one is that their terminal impact is reducing growth by 1.4%.
I'm gonna pause it for a second. I just think it's weird to go for like we get offense off of the status quo when the AF is the one changing the status quo. Like saying that, oh well, yeah, we don't have any quantification. Like that's just a bad argument. Just quantify it. Why wouldn't you have quantification?
Which is impossible to weigh. They haven't read terminal impacts to growth. And two is that their Haritz evidence is one line taken out of
That is true. There is no terminal impact to growth. That is something I pointed out earlier.
Which means that they have, it's just one line with no warranting, which means that they haven't read a link arguments. Their Yemen arguments overview is that the war in Yemen is being solved in the quo. Middle East eyes.
This is really smart.
Last week, the negotiations are happening and successful and will continue. Yusuf al-Otaiba at the Washington Post wrote late last year that thanks to American support, the coalition has driven the Houthis out of crucial strongholds along the Red Sea. As a result, Ramadan al-Sharbini at Gulf News reported in November that a number of leading Houthis have defected and their defeat is imminent. But ending arms sales destroys these negotiations because Way 18 at Penn State writes that talks are succeeding because the U.S.'s sales of arms to Saudi Arabia give it leverage over the empire and force Saudi Arabia to the table. Without that relationship, they will have no incentive to go to the table in the first place. And
this is where this debate should center in the back half for the Bens, right? Like, who controls the internal link to resolving for the actual conflict, right? Because all the impacts that are, like, quantified in this debate are predicated on the Civil War, not this, like, food crisis thing that Ben's talking about. And as a result, like, you should just go for who is winning, what will solve it, the status quo or the affirmative, and then why your story is more probable and preferable, and then you just get their impacts and win the debate.
Top level, there's no link because the UAE is actually leading the coalition because investigative journalist Carmelo Cruz at the International Policy Digest writes in 2018 that the UAE is quietly pulling the strings in the background. No reason they can't just fall in if Saudi Arabia doesn't have the strength. Their first link is about convincing Saudi Arabia, but absence the ability to sell arms to them, we have no leverage in order to convince them to the table. That was the Gway evidence that I read.
Oh, whatever. Let's just pause for a second. That UAE stuff, right? Like saying the UAE is secretly pulling the strings. You'll note that in the last speech, as far as I'm aware, the UAE stuff was not mentioned, the stuff that was brought up in cross-ex. That is not an argument that is in this debate as of this point, so it shouldn't be an argument that comes up in summary or in final focus, but I think it will.
Above, also Brazil can just fill in because the Human Rights Watch writes in December that they've already bought cluster munitions from Brazil to bomb civilians. Then on their legitimacy arguments, all their argument is just that the Houthis come to the table, but Saudi Arabia has no incentive to negotiate in a world where the U.S. doesn't pressure them, which means it's only a question of whether or not the U.S. can continue to pressure them.
All right, we'll watch this last cross-ex.
Yeah. First question.
Sure. So, your response in Sweden is saying that Saudi Arabia cares more about the U.S., right?
That's one of my two arguments.
Yeah, that was verbatim what you said. So if Saudi Arabia cares more about the U.S. and they care less about Sweden, but still return to their normal relations, they care more about the U.S., why would relations
They care more about arms sales from the U.S.
No, you said that they care more about the...
This is so dumb. Like, the semantic argument here that, like, no, you said this, and, like, Ben handles as well and just goes, yeah, right. Like, if that's what you want to go for, then go for it. But obviously, this is what I meant. You just asked the question, and now I'm answering what I meant. The judge should probably evaluate that.
U.S. relations. That was what you. That was your first.
Yeah, I misspoke slightly. What I meant to say is that they care more about arms sales with the U.S. and because of that, they would have more of an incentive to maintain continual pressure.
Sure. Does Saudi Arabia have more of a vested interest in continuing relations with Sweden or the U.S.?
Continuing relations?
Yeah.
Probably the U.S., but only if those relations involve arms sales.
Wait, why? Why does arms sales have to be there for that
because
relationship?
the piece of evidence we read on top of our case is extremely explicit that the reason that
it's
Saudi
all
Arabia
rhetoric.
cares
It says quote
It's all rhetoric. What a brilliant response.
What incentive does Saudi Arabia have to engage with the U.S. to give us military bases there?
Literally, all your
oil
counterterrorism, for example, or oil, all these things, Saudi Arabia benefits directly by having a relationship
Saudi Arabia
with the US.
benefits directly by manipulating global oil prices exactly in the U.S.'s interests?
No, cooperating with the U.S. on oil issues. Because the U.S. also imports quite a bit of oil from Saudi Arabia.
Okay, we can have that debate, I guess.
Okay.
Let's talk about this Germany stuff. If the reason that our evidence says that there was no change in oil prices is because Germany continued arms sales, why does this not prove that Saudi Arabia
So
will
your entire
continue?
impact derives off a short-term thing. Like immediately when relations end, Saudi gets really mad so they spike prices. So if it didn't happen the year after, there's no reason why they would wait 7
Our
years.
evidence says the reason it didn't happen is because Germany returned.
Yeah, after 2 years.
Wait, no, it says Saudi Arabia spiked oil and then
No,
Germany
it doesn't.
returned.
Like, you guys can call for the card.
This is a very important part of the debate that I wish I had the evidence for to know, because like whether Germany returned immediately or 2 years later or whatever is incredibly important.
And of oil, it doesn't say oil a single time. It says like consumer or like commercial stuff, but it doesn't say oil. I have a question.
Yeah.
Cool. So what is the UAE doing right now?
Dogs barking. Will the dog stop barking? All right, thank you, Lucy.
What is the UAE
Oh.
doing now?
Yeah.
So they have 60 fighter jets, which are
No. I'm saying like relative to like what are they doing on the ground right now?
on the ground. They're helping with the blockade of
No,
Libya.
they've halted offensive campaigns.
A
And they're
blockade is not an offensive campaign.
No, they
That's a really good response from Ben.
halted their attacks, and the reason why
Attacks are not a blockade.
is because they've had so many civilian casualties and like
Also, they're not reading any evidence that says any of this stuff.
landmines drones. There's
Wait.
internal pressure within the UAE to pull out and engage in
Airstriking
negotiations.
someone has nothing to do with civilian. Like UAE civilians won't die because they're airstriking.
No,
someone.
but like their soldiers died.
Wait, if
How do their soldiers die if they're airstriking?
the UAE soldiers die because they airstrike
Yeah.
someone with.
No, the
drones and
UAE
fighter
doesn't do
jets?
airstrikes. Saudi Arabia, in
No.
the coalition, Saudi Arabia does the
Our
airstrikes,
evidence
the UAE
says-
does ground troops.
our evidence
UAE
says that-
ground troops
but
have specifically died at a
reason-
very alarming rate in
The
recent
reason that
months.
Saudi Arabia does arms
Not a warranted argument.
does airstrikes now is because they have U.S. aid. But,
Yeah.
the UAE has 70 modern fighter jets. There's no reason that in a world where the U.S. stops helping Saudi Arabia with their
Yeah, I
airstrikes,
mean, we're going to
the
make
UAE
responses on
can't
why the
fly.
UAE is pulling out of the war right now, and why even if that is
Should have done that sooner, by the way. The UAE part's already been in the debate.
not true, the UAE is a comparative advantage over Saudi and UAE cooperating. Because the UAE is more likely to accept the peace process.
Why?
For example, there's been internal pressure within the UAE to start to move towards a
They
diplomatic
just keep. Okay, we'll talk about this at the end. This internal pressure thing is bullshit.
solution. That's why the president's come out and says he wants to engage in this.
That's fair.
Great. That's where we're going to stop this because it's already been exceptionally long. Let me just give a recap here of my primary thoughts in terms of both teams and then comment on the overrated thing I previously mentioned. So, one, I think Gunn's problem is that a lot of what they're doing, I mean, I guess it's not even a problem. It's like bullshit and they're getting away with it. But a lot of what they do, near as I can tell, is in cross-ex, they make completely unwarranted arguments that are then not explained in the debate, but then are leveraged in the back half of the debate as if they were never responded to. But those weren't arguments made in the debate. They were in cross-ex. They were not in your speech time. They are not carded. They are not warranted, right? This internal pressure thing is not warranted. The UAE thing is not warranted. Like, the growth thing, even like the explanation of it, is not warranted. And it's weird because they have this kill shot here in terms of counterterrorism efforts are turned because they result in cracking down on civilian populations. That's what they should have ended up going for in this debate, like hands down, because Ben gets up and literally just says, like, we're not going for the counterterrorism stuff. Like, that's a free win for you that actually occurred in your speech. For the Bens, I think the Bens are much better at just actual answers and questions in cross-ex. I think they're better at, like, answers than questions, which is weird. They always seem to be answering questions rather than like asking them, which whatever, maybe it's just a thing they're into as a result of Parley experience. But I think that, one, as I've already pointed out, it was a massive mistake to just say we're not going for the counterterrorism stuff. I think it's also a massive mistake to just go for, yeah, our impact's not quantified, but like we can win based on the status quo. I think that they're doing a fairly good job of interacting with some of the warrants from the other side, but like they're just not calling bullshit on a lot of these arguments that are integral to the affirmative's case in terms of like understanding the status quo or like the political pressures that are going on, sort of all of that kind of stuff. I think there's just like a much easier debate for either side to win on this. So with all of that said, I want to just talk about this like overrated thing from the comment on YouTube from whoever that person was, because they just said like, hey, can you watch this video with like the Bens and then Gunn? I think the Bens are pretty overrated, blah 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 blah. I think that's a really like stupid and ignorant and irrelevant thing to say. Like, I don't know what you mean by overrated in the first place, because it's like, how rated are they? Who is rating them? I think that they're clearly like fairly solid debaters, and I think that if they were having a parley debate with these kids, they would wax them 100 million%. Like, this PF thing is just something they're doing in their off time, and I think it's just kind of weird and rude to be like, they're not as good as everyone else says they are. If other people think they're good, then they're probably good. Like, it's possible to have hard outings at TOC or NSDA or whatever and still be a good team. And I think it's just a weird thing to assert, like, hey, watch this video so you can tell me how overrated they are. I don't think they're overrated. I think they're rated just fine. They're very rated.